to the University of Manitoba Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Café Scientifique. As you may have heard from previous ones, if you've been to these events before, these were started by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research as a means of getting health research and health research results out to the community in an informal, interactive setting. These are not meant to be lectures, these are meant to be discussions with the experts that we typically bring along. And this evening, the topic, as you well know, and that's why you're here tonight, is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and the need for a 21st century human rights solution, which I think is a really very interesting topic. So my job tonight is to introduce the moderator for this evening, which is Professor Karen Busby, sitting behind the lectern. And I've known Karen for a long time, and I know how hard she works, and I can go through all the usual stuff. She is a professor in the Faculty of Law, very interested, dare I say, passionate about human rights. She was the driving force behind the establishment of the center, or the formal research center for human rights research at the University of Manitoba, the first journal devoted to human rights research in Canada. And Karen was instrumental in spearheading the successful bid by the University of Manitoba to host the Truth and Reconciliation Commission National Archives on Indian Residential Schools. So I had a dean once who was my boss, and he said that he always wanted his faculty members to be what he called, and I quote, a good corporate citizen. Well, I can certainly say that Karen Busby is more than that. She's a great corporate citizen, and she will be your moderator this evening. Karen.
That was a kind introduction. I've had tremendous support from the University of Manitoba by years, and I really appreciate it. So I'd like to welcome everybody here. I'm your moderator tonight for this evening's discussion. So here's just a few minutes, a few tips on how we're going to proceed. We have three panelists tonight, and each of them will speak for about 5 minutes, and Janine's going to keep track of them and make sure that they stay within their 5-minute period. After all the panelists have spoken, I'll open the floor up for discussion. I'll be passing a wireless microphone, this microphone, and I'd ask you to use the microphone because, as you can tell, you can't hear if I don't use the microphone. This evening's panel is being video recorded for uploading on the Café Scientifique website, and someone is taking photographs, as you can see. And we're also live tweeting the Café tonight. The hashtag is #Café Scientifique if you'd like to follow the conversation or if you'd like to participate by tweeting. And we're going to go until about 8:25, so we'll take questions until about 8:25. You'll also notice that there are evaluation forms on the tables and chairs, and we'd ask that you fill those out and leave them on the materials table at the end of the evening. You'll also notice that there's a ballot box on the materials table to put your name into at the end of the evening for an end of evening draw for a Café Scientifique mug. But you have to be present at the end of the evening when we draw for the mug. I also want to mention there's some snacks here, so if you're really desperate for a cup of coffee or something sweet, please help yourself as we go along. So that brings me to tonight's panel. Dr. Albert Chudley is the Medical Director of Genetics and Metabolism Program, and he's a professor in the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health, Biochemistry, and Medical Genetics at the University of Manitoba. His clinical and research interests are in the area of recognition, delineation, and prevention of birth defects, including fetal alcohol syndrome, developmental disabilities, and autism spectrum disorders, genetic mapping, and gene discovery. He served on the FASD Advisory Committee of the Public Health Agency of Canada, and he's co-lead in the FAS stream of the NeuroDevNet. Dr. Brenda Elias is a faculty member in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba, and she's worked extensively with First Nations communities to address health inequities, and is the project principal investigator of Translating to the Community, a social-nutritional epigenetic study of FDSD. And finally, Marcia Simmons is a proud member of the Barons River First Nation and a mother of 4. As the Success Through Advocacy and Role Modeling, or STAR program manager for FDSD mentoring, her main area of focus is case management and advocacy with mothers who reside on reserve and who have used alcohol or other drugs during pregnancy. This site services 8 First Nations in Manitoba, but due to extreme lack of services, the STAR program must be creative in its programming to link clients to appropriate off-reserve services. Marcia's 11 years with the Southeast Resource Development Council has resulted in her having strong working relationships with the communities from grassroots to professionals. So please welcome me in joining our 3 panelists tonight.
Well, I'm Brenda Elias, and it's a great pleasure to be here today and welcome on this very cool evening. FASD FASD, a spectrum disorder. It's an exposure in pregnancy, long thought. But recent research is also suggesting that a man's exposure to alcohol, and when a woman doesn't have exposure to an alcohol, could also lead to the development of learning disabilities in children, including behavioral disabilities. And so it's not just a woman and a man's issue, it's both. We live in a culture that's, as I referred to Ab, we have a brewing and a distilling culture, and alcohol consumption is socially accepted. And we have a history, and it's a bit of an unfortunate history, whereby we talk about something being 100% preventable, alcohol in pregnancy. However, a woman may not know she's pregnant. And men may not be aware that their consumption of alcohol can affect the development of their child. Now, because of all these unknowns and this idea that it's 100% preventable, and then we have a diagnosis that has the A in it, alcohol, and there is this discipline and punish that goes on, I would go on and say, is that it's challenging, it's stigmatizing, it's discriminating, and if someone discloses it, people get this thought about what happened, this bad mother, this bad father. And I would argue that maybe we should be changing that definition. We could talk about it a little bit later. But in the course of understanding FASD, there's been several studies that have been funded, and we have been very fortunate to be funded under the Canadian Institutes of Health Research for the epigenetics of FASD. And so we have our colleagues, Jeff Hicks, who's working at the cellular level, and there's Moshkin that's working with the cell level as well. We have individuals working with the mouse models, Jeff, and then Abraham Fengsod, that's working with frogs. And then we're moving up from the animal models, and we're looking at brain tissues. And what we're looking at is a biological characteristic, a biomarker of FASD. And this is derived from some of the work at NeuroDovNet that Chudley has been involved with, where we're looking at samples that were taken from a study, and we're looking at what those biomarkers are to develop a reliable test, a diagnostic test that could be done early on to avoid a late diagnosis or no diagnosis. And then someone is challenged, and they end up in various systems. They fall out of the education system, they're engaged in the social system, and they can end up in the welfare system, or ultimately they could die a horrific death. And we had an account of that at one of our planning meetings for this grant. The part that I'm involved is the social in front of the epigenetics. And to give you a sense of what I'm working on, and you know, when a mother and a father, they take out their photos and they want to show you what you're working on. Well, I brought a prop because we couldn't use PowerPoint. And this is what I'm working on, and I'm really proud to show this birth of this study that starts with the mother. And there's the father, and there's this complex web. There's a biology, and there's all these social factors linked to it. There is the father's characteristics, and you can see how chaotic it is. There's so many various dimensions. Then there is the social environment, the nutritional environment is very important as well. And then what goes on in the fetal environment. And then we have the child, a child that may go undiagnosed for a great period of time. They may not get diagnosed until 12 or maybe not at all. And then there's the service environment that they're engaged in. Again, a very complex web. And then there's lifelong support. And children fall through the cracks, and adults fall through the cracks even more so if there's no service involvement. And then we have these multiple complex systems that they have to negotiate, families have to negotiate. And so when we were asked about doing this scientific cafe, the immediate thought that came to mind is that we have a human rights issue. We have a lifelong disability that goes undiagnosed. And meanwhile, we have an individual, and we have a family, and we have communities that are dealing with a pathologizing diagnosis. The bad mother, the bad father, and the damaged child. It's not the special child, it's the damaged child. That's totally inappropriate, I would argue, and it calls for a human rights 21st century approach.
Okay, good evening everybody. My name is Marcia Simmons, and I work frontline in a tribal council that services 8 First Nations in Manitoba. So typically when you think of First Nations in the South, you think, oh, they have a lot of access to services. But actually that's not true. 5 of our communities are remote isolated. In fact, one of our communities, Pongassi First Nation, is the most isolated community in Manitoba. They don't even have an airstrip. So just the logistics of being isolated has connotations attached to it. But where my area of concern is, and I'm glad my coworkers are here, is the intergenerational traumas and the intergenerational effects of colonization. I'm not saying this out of a political realm, but just factual. These are facts. So the systematic, assimilation of the Indian residential school systems, the isolation and displacement in community, those kinds of things have played, a big part into what the present situation is now. So in our program, we don't call it FASD. We receive our funding from Manitoba First Nation Inuit Health Branch. But see, we don't want to stigmatize them by calling it the FASD program, so we renamed it to Success Through Advocacy and Role Modeling. This program, by its name, does role modeling and advocacy on behalf of clients. The only requirement is that mom admits that she drank during a recent or is currently pregnant and used alcohol. So the biggest issues we face are moms not knowing they're pregnant, like Dr. Elias mentioned, and lack of services in community, I should say. So one of the questions that doesn't sit well with me is our program's 3-year home visitation program. We presume many of our clients are affected with FASD themselves. Is it ethical to only offer them service for 3 years? So that's a dilemma that we face, but at the same time we've bent the rules and we've had clients for like 7, 8 years. They don't want to exit, and we don't want to trigger them. And sometimes we're the only people positive in their lives that they have, and we feel that that's very special. And we like to offer the best culturally competent and culturally sensitive programming possible. So some of the issues personally that really bother me are the labeling of the moms. I've yet to meet a monster, and I work with 57 that I case manage currently, but also we work and advocate for more, but those are the ones we have files for. And there's such a stigma that people believe that these women are intentionally trying to harm their children. And there's just so many layers. It's like an onion. You peel back the layers. There's so much there that these women love, like you wouldn't believe. They love so powerfully that it affects all of us, and it's a wonderful motivator in my work. But at the same time, when you have little hope for the future, and you have many hurdles in your way, it's difficult to work with people in that predicament. So what we do, and in all levels of our programming, is empowerment. We feel that whatever big or small, their self-efficacy will improve, and their outcomes are better as long as they have a gentle, person guiding their journey. The only problem is, for a province with 63 First Nations, there's only a $1.9 million budget for FNIB-funded programs. That's really small. We're not hitting enough communities. And I'm sitting here not only representing those 8 First Nations I work for, but the rest that are falling through the cracks. Thanks. That's it.
I'm Chudley, just by default, I guess. Heard the other 2 speakers. And my background is in pediatrics and neonatology and medical genetics, and my interest in FASD extends over a few decades. I won't tell you how many decades. The focus has been on how to accurately diagnose children and adolescents and adults with FASD, and we developed a national guideline and standards a number of years ago, and I just came back from Vancouver on Friday night from a meeting where we're looking at revisions of the guidelines to try to get it right. We're talking about rights here, and one of the ways to have rights is to do things properly and accurately.
I've also been involved in looking at prevalence, like how common is the effects of prenatal alcohol exposure, and how does it present itself. One could look at the whole population. That's very difficult to do because nobody has the money to look at a population study. But there are different populations we have looked at. We've looked at newborns. We've looked at children who have learning disabilities. We've looked at children who are in care. We've looked at adolescents and adults who are incarcerated or who have difficulties with the law. And all those points I've mentioned because these are high-risk groups for identifying the effects of prenatal alcohol exposure. How common is FASD? Well, we estimate around 1%. There was a study done by Giddy Corin in Grey Bruce County in Ontario, and they determined that 2.5% of neonates were exposed to significant amounts of alcohol. We know about half the children that are exposed to significant amounts of alcohol have effects of that and have a diagnosis of FASD. So that equates to between 1 and 2% in a low-risk average population. Babies in intensive care nurseries and NICUs who have birth defects and are premature, the prevalence in that group is 10 times higher than the general population. We were involved in doing an adult study in Stony Mountain. We found a minimum incidence of 10% among the inmates who came into Stony Mountain out of remand after sentencing. In youth justice, we've got more than 10%. We don't have the prevalence or incidence studies here, but in a study done in BC, it showed 23% incidence of youth offenders had evidence of FASD. So that's been what I've been involved with. I'm interested in biomarkers, and I'm a geneticist and used to run a cytogenetics lab, and still am involved in identifying genetic causes of birth defects. FAS is not necessarily considered a genetic disorder because it's due to the exposures of alcohol in pregnancy that we call teratogenic. But we know there are some individuals that are vulnerable, and we know that there are others that may be protective. And these may have a basis in the genes. And there's fairly good evidence now that not everybody's going to have the same effects from the same amount of exposure at the same time in pregnancy. So we're trying to work out some of those details. When you look at the effects on the genome from alcohol, we know that over 600 genes have been impacted by this. Some are downregulated, some are upregulated. That means some are turned off and some are turned on. So we're also interested in the effects of controlling turning on and turning off genes without changing the genetic code. And that's called epigenetics. And those are an area of focus we have in this. So I think there are a lot of issues about rights and protecting children, protecting mothers, the stigmatization. Who's responsible? Well, I think everybody has a degree of responsibility, including the government. The government of Manitoba has been very generous in the support to a lot of the initiatives we have in the Manitoba FASD Centre and the diagnostics. That's been expanded, and $11 to $12 million a year is spent in programs for children who are already diagnosed and are being diagnosed with FASD. But there's also the responsibility of the alcohol industry and the promotion. It's a tidal wave of drink because this will make you happy. This is how you celebrate success. In fact, it's a poison. We don't know what level of safe we think because that's dependent on your genotype. So we feel it's best not to avoid alcohol if you're planning a pregnancy or a pregnant. So I think I've been lecturing. I'd like to hear others' views, and we can then discuss issues related to rights of the child, the mother, the community, and such. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now is the time where we open the floor to questions and comments. This is Café Scientifique, so it should be about a conversation, and that's why the opening comments from the panelists have been quite short. So I open it up. Who would like to start with a comment or a question for any of our panelists?
A little while back, I was thumbing through the newspaper, and in one of those back pages that nobody ever reads, there was a little bit of an article, and it alluded to the possibility of the fact that FASD tends to be diagnosed in poor communities, on the reserves, etc. But it also said that for many years it has existed in Tuxedo, River Heights, wherever, but was often diagnosed as some other issue because of the stigma that's involved. So to me that brings up two issues. One is, if all the statistics were there and accurate, funding would be much more available, the stigma would be much less, and it would become an issue of human rights. And then the other issue is, to me there's an ethical issue in the medical community. If you can diagnose FASD on Pritchard Avenue, you can diagnose it, if you're someplace out by Simply Park. And I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Well, one comment is I think the medical community believes the prevalence of FASD is probably underrepresented in individuals of non-Aboriginal descent. Why is that? Well, maybe there are protective factors, nutritional factors, stress. We know nutrition deficiencies and stress can alter function of genes and can aggravate the effects of alcohol. So there may be a difference in the frequency of presentation, the severity of presentation, when you combine stress, nutritional problems, and alcohol in any given group. And I think any group that's underprivileged, where there may be nutritional problems and a lot of stress and lack of supports, it's going to be magnified. I think the other reality is that a lot of the referrals that come to our clinic are children in care. They're already identified as a high-risk group. There are 10,000 children in Manitoba under care of Child and Family Services. And a high proportion of those are First Nations children. So there's been a breakdown in the social supports. And we are looking at a high-risk group, but a selective group. So how do we identify those kids in River Heights and Fort Richmond, where I live? We haven't gone into the schools. We haven't done the studies. There are a lot of ethical issues about that. But I think there are many that are underdiagnosed and are identified as having a conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder or ADHD. And in fact, maybe the basis to this may be, in part, the prenatal alcohol exposure.
What I'm seeing in community is, like Dr. Chudley mentioned, most of the children that are being diagnosed are in care. So they have somebody with a Bachelor of Social Work that's working and guiding that process, So for parents that I work with that don't have children in care, they see little benefit to the diagnosis, so we do a lot of education on what are the benefits. But at the same time, there's that ethical issue. Okay, we're going to get them a diagnosis, then what? My argument is we need to provide evidence that there's a need, say for occupational therapy, speech therapy, those kinds of things. So I believe that has a big issue into why we see predominantly First Nation people. And at the same time, the wait list is really long and it's really hard to motivate people to, okay, let's get all this information. You have to admit these horrible things you've done, and to people you don't really know, and wait a year and a half and see what happens. I actually got a chance to be with a client during that process because I wanted to see where are referring people. I was really happy with what I saw and the one-on-one attention and the fact that once that door opened for her, she has an amazing amount of resources. She lives in the city. She doesn't live on reserve. So there's a disconnect there. There needs to be more of an incentive for them, as far as what is the benefit for their child.
We had the opportunity to actually link the clinical registry to the health service utilization database, and we actually identified 71% of clients who have been diagnosed by FASD by the clinic are First Nations. and a lot of them are based on this referral. And their use of the healthcare system is that they're in for a lot of injuries and other related types of trauma. There's mental health conditions, and so there's a high use of the healthcare system. And this is a group that has been brought into a clinic. We have no idea what the other group looks like.
Just to follow up on that, just by what you said, what that tells me, if this is a human rights issue, we all know that poor are not exactly, don't exactly have the best advocates for human rights. And because we systemically don't identify the people out that way, or out that way, the doctors will say he identified a number of other diagnoses. If we knew what the real numbers were, if we did the research where they were, and all of a sudden, you know, we have similar numbers coming in from the other parts of the population, now we can do something with the human rights issue.
Maybe just I could address that very briefly. That's exactly why we're doing the research, so that we can identify affected children through biomarkers that more accurately can predict effects. So you have a biomarker of exposure, a biomarker of effect, and which could be used as a diagnostic, and a biomarker of risk. And this may differ in populations, but it may ultimately, a biomarker of effect or a biomarker for diagnosis, diagnostic purposes, may be the answer, because identifying a diagnosis of FASD is very time and resource heavy, which requires a multidisciplinary team. And doctors out in the community can't make a diagnosis on their own. It has to be done using multiple assessments of the child from different perspectives, using different professional tools.
I'm curious to ask a question, also to raise a similar issue that you have with human rights, which is that I'm somewhat curious about whether it makes any difference whether what you have is FASD or whether what you have is some other kind of developmental disability. All of these things, from what I have learned, have very similar kinds of varied effects on a person that are very wide-ranging and in different ways. And so I wonder whether there's a difference, because what I have seen in my life is that if you have a child for whom there is not an admitted use of alcohol, then you don't have a child with FASD. You have a child with PDD and ADHD and all of the things that you just said. You have exactly that child. And the truth is, so that's what I'm curious about, is does it make any difference whether you have FASD? And from a rights perspective and a service provision perspective, which is what I am most concerned about, is service provision, which is all very slotted to, you know, FASD programs here and this autism program here and that program there, and you know, you might have somebody who just kind of doesn't quite slide into any of those factors, and then your rights as a person who in fact can't function properly and needs a lot of support might not even exist presently, no matter where you were born or where you're growing up or whatever. And so I'm curious about that from a scientific point of view, whether there is much of a difference between these different kinds of brain-based things. And then also, how do we approach it from a human rights perspective when we have these huge, varied effects, and nevertheless, people who are they're not just 5 years old or 6 years old, when everybody's so interested and so happy to assess them and do all these things, and then suddenly they're 17 or 18 years old, and there doesn't exist those kinds of supports and programs.
Well, from a medical and scientific model, I wish that was correct, but unfortunately the prognosis, outcomes, and the treatments are all different based on the diagnosis. So a child with developmental delay due to Fragile X syndrome has a different trajectory, different treatment, and different outcomes than a child with FASD. We don't see children with Down syndrome in prisons. So this is a very different disorder that requires a very specialized approach and different treatments from other children with other developmental disabilities. We don't treat children with FASD with behavioral modification therapy like we do children with autism. So I think it's essential. If I have a high blood sugar, I want my doctor to know it's due to insulin insufficiency or insulin resistance and not due to a cortisol tumor somewhere. And the treatment is quite different. Even though on the surface it may appear to be similar. But these are different disorders with different outcomes, different treatments.
So the marker's critical.
The diagnosis, I think, is essential. I mean, that's been the basis of the medical model since the early Greeks.
Right, but my point is that you can't get that diagnosis without parental admission, right? You're just stuck if you have that kid.
There might be other means of corroboration and collateral information from reliable sources that is available, and we try that to the nth degree. But that's important to have. And, well, we could go on, but I think there are other questions.
There's Raymond that...
I have two types of questions that I'd like to ask. One has to do with the diagnosis itself. I think you said that the province is spending how many millions of dollars on fetal alcohol? My understanding is that each person who suffers from fetal alcohol probably will cost society well over $1 million a person in their lifetime, which means that the amount of money being spent on research right now to solve the problem is minuscule and totally inadequate for the size of the problem. Getting the diagnosis, as from personal experience in our own family, has not been easy because our child is adopted and we don't know if the birth mother used alcohol. And that's one of the essential criteria for determining somebody has fetal alcohol. I hope in your discussions in Vancouver that issue was raised because even if you're told that your child has the characteristics consistent with fetal alcohol, if you cannot establish that the birth mother in fact was drinking, your child is not eligible for services from the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder program. Given the high percentage of First Nations people or Aboriginal people who are suffering from fetal alcohol, I wonder whether it isn't a human rights issue of discrimination that this condition of knowing the birth mother doesn't prohibit a large number of persons from getting the services they need. So that's my first comment. Is this issue of diagnosis going to address that? My other question relates to once a diagnosis occurs, what kind of services are available? In, I think it was 2009, Kent Roach from the University of Toronto Law School and Andrea Bailey wrote an article in the BC Law Review which looked at the fetal alcohol from the point of view of the courts. And they found that from the arrest right up to the sentencing, it's the courts in Canada that are dealing with fetal alcohol, and virtually at that time in 2009, very little social programs dealing with the issue. Somebody has fetal alcohol, you put them in jail because the behavior is so disruptive. And I wonder to what extent we are aware of the degree to which the courts are being asked to solve the problem rather than social services. I think it's abominable. I recognize that the province of Manitoba is making great strides in dealing with infants and teenagers, but for adults, the amount of programming for those with fetal alcohol is just so inadequate. I don't know what word to use. It's just a tragedy.
Well, I could speak somehow along this way with the legalities. I get what you're saying. All of a sudden, I have a couple coworkers here. All of a sudden, now we're GLADU report writers. You know, filling a void for people that really don't belong in prison, and it's just probably the worst place for them. And out of these reports we're writing, you know, we're not trained particularly in them, but we can sure research, we can sure write well, and we can sure help them in any capacity we can. So that's where not working in silos is a good thing, you know, helping in any way you can. So with these GLADU reports, if they have been successful in, you know, getting lower sentencing or fines or treatment centers and things like that for clients that would have served time, that's all I can say for that.
A colleague of ours from the community came to one of our sessions when we were planning the writing around this grant, and we asked her to talk about the economic costs of being a foster mother. And she accounted the life of a child she fostered, and the number of times this child from ages 3 to when she got to know her at the age of 8 was in and out of various systems, the child welfare system, in and out, in and out, in and out. And then struggling, can't be in school, and eventually ends up in the justice system, in the Manitoba Youth Center, and then in and out, in and out, and in and out. And was engaged in prostitution as a result of her impulsive behavior and being misled down that path by others. And between the ages of 12 and almost 18, she estimated that it came to a cost of $1 million. And that's one person. She didn't make it past her 18th. She didn't make it to her 18th birthday. She was murdered. And so we don't add that economic cost into the loss of that life, and we should. I mean, we haven't even thought through how we should be even calculating the cost of this. And that's a human rights issue because we're not looking at it. But to give our government's credit is that they've launched several initiatives called the Early Developmental Index, and they're starting to look in schools as to the behavior of children and why things aren't working well with them. And our work research is suggesting that we need to do much more before they are in school. But there's a lot of creative minds coming around the table and introducing what's called complex theory to sort of understand all this chaos that goes on with children that have developmental disabilities. And bringing together multiple disciplines around the table, not only scientists, but bringing in community members, those affected, their family members, and individuals across the various service units and across the various systems to start mapping out these pathways. And there's some really interesting success stories that are coming about, and a lot of this is attributed to a man of Clyde's Hertzman who just recently passed away, unfortunately, who ran with this idea of social epidemiology and inserted between social and epidemiology social justice epidemiology, about bringing that science to understand this complexity, and then working together with epigeneticists and cell biologists and neurodegenerative scientists and individuals in the nutritional sciences. And there's some really interesting promise coming out of the nutritional sciences that perhaps because of food insecurity, poverty, and if you improve nutrition, preconception, but also nutrition during the pregnancy, but the nutrition of the child who is diagnosed with FASD. And there's a novel study being conducted in the United States as we speak that found nutritional levels were lower in children with FASD of a certain type of nutrient. And what, unbeknownst to them, and they didn't plan this in the study, but they increased the nutrition, that supplement, and the behavior changed. And so there are some novel things that are being thought through and designed, and we have our nutritional scientists here, Myung and Michael, who are leading that very innovative research to look at that there's possibilities of intervention as well. But these are interventions that must be made available. And we have to be conscious of this individual who will do things and will not remember that they've done these things. And we have to be vigilant and always be there for them. And yes, FASD is a human rights issue. It is a lifelong disability.
Sorry, my comments kind of what this gentleman was talking about earlier. I thought I'd share a story you might find interesting, but it's regarding who's on the agenda, who we're paying attention to, and who's getting diagnosed. And the short version is about 3 years ago, I had 3 medical students from Europe come to do an independent study, and they were asked to pick a target population that they thought was at high risk and to design an office-based intervention to bridge the gap between the students, the population and the physicians. Well, what I found interesting about this is that the student from Italy chose high-performing professional women in their 30s. That might be something we might need to consider in North America.
Good point.
I'd be interested in hearing what might be some non-blaming, non-stigmatizing, positive ways of actually maybe having prevention in the first place from, again, a perspective of, again, maybe getting upstream of this, because as we're hearing, it's so much time and effort that needs to happen, but it is a lot, and if something can be done to reduce the incidence of FASD in the first place, I think even small impacts have a large impact down the road, so I'd be interested in any ideas in that regard.
Look at a package of cigarettes. 50% of that label is stipulated by the Canadian government to be a health warning. Now look at a bottle of beer, bottle of whiskey. The heavy drinking guidelines is 3 to 5 drinks at a sitting. People I work with are just getting started. We're seeing astronomical amounts of alcohol where, during intake and during exit, we set the baseline of the intake. How many alcohol drinks does it take you to get a buzz? I drink like this much of the bottle. We've heard like 3, 2, 6s, things like that. There is a huge amount of alcohol being used by a lot of people. After all the traumas that these women have encountered from birth, or even in utero, it's no wonder so many of them drink. It's no wonder so many of them numb out. And it's no wonder I can't believe they're alive. I have yet to intake a woman who has not been suicidal. That's a travesty. The society is failing these women. Why would they feel so low and so unappreciated that they feel that suicide is a readily good answer? It's tragic. At the same time, the rites of passage, 18 years, who goes to the bar? In the community, it can be a lot younger. We gauge, how old were you when you first drank? The one that really affected me, I had a lot of vicarious trauma from it, is during Christmas, where people are supposed to be having fun and, living the good life. During Christmas, her aunt got her drunk when she was 5 years old, and they laughed at her because she couldn't walk up the stairs. That really bothered me, because do we live in this world where these things are hidden? Or do we need to bring them out in a non-judgmental, blaming way? And it's difficult. At the same time, the government that funds our communities knows that First Nations didn't vote them in, and we will not fund them. So $1.9 million for a province this size, with this much alcohol being used, bootleggers just making enormous money, it's not working. So we're speaking of alcohol as far as whiskey, vodka, beer, but what we're seeing is a lot of homebrew. I don't think people realize that. There's a way to make a drink that is so potent, it's like a cup of water and yeast, some kind of fast-acting yeast concoction, and people are getting drunk in a real stumbling, foaming at the mouth kind of way. So I've even heard people using intravenous you know, they'd have a group of them and they would inject alcohol in their veins and have like a big old party with just a Mickey. These things are scary, and at the same time, you know, I don't blame them for, you know, and a lot of us don't blame them why they're in the predicament they're in. It's sad, and we want to empower them. We want them to realize this isn't what life should be about. And
You know, when we talk about, you know, this 100% prevention, and we have the photograph of the woman who's pregnant and holding a wine glass, it's a lot more complicated than that. And in Canada, we didn't have a mental health policy, and we have a national mental health policy. The province has developed their mental health policy and brought together groups of experts to look at various dimensions of it. The rate of mental health conditions amongst men and women, non-Indigenous and Indigenous, are astronomical. And I've done the data here in Manitoba, and it's yet to be published, but it is startling. I was shocked, because everyone talks about diabetes, and I'm sitting there thinking, we should be talking about mental health, because the rates are so high, and the rates for substance abuse as well. And the First Nation population in Manitoba have the highest rates, doesn't matter where they live, for mental health conditions, and the same applies for substance abuse. And yet we talk about these chronic conditions, cancer's increasing and diabetes increasing, but we don't look at our mental health numbers. And fortunate in Manitoba that we can, and we have done this. So we have to look at multi-pronged interventions upstream. And it's not just about alcohol, it's the alcohol and the determinants of alcohol and addiction behaviors. And we have to look at mental health conditions. And we've got intergenerational trauma from the residential school system, both direct exposure to the residential school and the exposure to a parent or grandparent. And we know that women are at greater risk, and coupled with that is a history of abuse. And associated with that is these addictions and suicide behaviors, and there is little wonder why people numb out. And these are some of the upstreams that we have to look at. So when we talk about prevention, it's more than a label on a bottle.
it's also with the education. So prevention, that goes hand in hand. I'm a university student, and I recently presented to my university class some FASD things, you know, typical things that I think everybody would know, especially a university student, and it was amazing. Like, they didn't know anything. And I said, okay, the point of this, I didn't think they would know so few things, but the point of this, how can this group in university, you know, who is an educated group, not know things that people in community with little education opportunities, you know, a lot of them are starving, a lot of them are hungry, a lot of them don't have their basic needs met. They don't have shelter, they don't have water, they don't have food. How are they supposed to understand that they're harming their baby? A lot of times, like, I'm really glad Brenda brought up about the nutrition. When you're hungry, you're not thinking anything about that except that hunger. And if alcohol helps you to numb, I don't blame, you know, of course I don't want to see that. Of course I don't want to see a pregnant, big-bellied woman at a party, everybody else drinking around her, partying, having a good time. I don't want to see that either, but at the same time, to see change, we have to tailor to their needs. It's not a cookie cutter, like my sister always says. All these cookie cutter responses, they're not going to work.
Thanks. Just a comment and a question. In my own training in FASD, I usually make a point of saying the holding back on drinking is not just if you're planning to become pregnant or if you are pregnant, because 50% of all pregnancies are unplanned. So it's best to never drink in a binge drinking way or in a more than one drink at a time way. And that goes for women and men, because men are influencing drinking patterns and what they do. My question is for Dr. Chudley, with the diagnose anything that's being considered in and talked about in changing those?
Well, the original guidelines we developed in 2005, and we started 2.5, 3 years before that time, so it's been almost a decade. There's issues of terminology, there's issues of brain domains, which areas do we think are more consistent with alcohol exposure and not. And we don't have a behavioral phenotype. We don't have characteristics that would identify. So there isn't an imprint on psychological evaluations or behavioral evaluations say that's FASD. That would be nice. We're looking for it. It doesn't exist because people have different genetic backgrounds. They have different times in which they're drinking, and different times of exposure in the pregnancy results in different effects. And it's all over, whether it's binge drinking or daily drinking or once a month drinking. There can be significant effects at different times in different places throughout the pregnancy. So in terms of the guidelines, I could tell you the alcohol issue is still a necessary requirement because we don't have that characteristic that you can see in every child. That does not exist. I would love it to exist. If they've got the facial features, and only 10% of the children we see in our clinics have all the facial features, then we could say this, and probably only that, or most probably with high specificity and sensitivity, that's alcohol. But the 90% or 80% remaining, it's clinical judgment looking at brain domain impairments. So the sneak preview is we've changed a little bit about terminology. And it's not finalized yet. I haven't seen the draft from our meeting yet. But we're going to make FASD an acceptable term diagnostically now, rather than trying to break it down into 3 or 4 different subcategories. There will be broader categories, but so that's a sneak preview. Does that answer your question? Partly.
You mentioned the 10% of kids who have the facial features. Can you diagnose FAS without confirmation on basis?
Yes.
Okay.
We've always done
Okay.
that. Since 1973 onward, that has been a consistent recommendation by the medical profession. But in the beginning, that's all we didn't see the children with behavioral problems and cognitive impairments that didn't have the face. We didn't know that was FASD until, in the last 15, 20 years.
I also remember hearing Sterling Claren, who was behind the U.S. diagnostic guideline, well, not fully behind, talking about...
The University of Washington for the Jacob
yes,
yes.
Talking about how, and I've also seen this in my own training, I'll have women come up to me afterwards and say, you just described my kid to a T, but honestly, I did not drink during pregnancy. So I remember Claren saying, a lot of the characteristics we see in kids with ARMD, we might see in kids who weren't alcohol exposed, so they kind of went the way of saying, these kids have certain problems, and they are alcohol exposed, but not going as far as saying it's alcohol related. And so I kind of wondered if Canada's going to go in a similar direction of not necessarily linking the two, but just saying, well, it's there, but we can't say for sure it's related.
Well, it's there because you've seen them in a clinic to be evaluated because they have problems. So you're not any further ahead in terms of identifying what's the purpose and how do we best treat these. Or do we assume they're all affected because of the alcohol? I think that's a bit dangerous. Like, when do we start treating high blood pressure? Well, we have a cutoff that's based on standard deviations. So we've taken that approach of cutoffs based on cognitive impairments and some of the physical findings.
I was wondering whether there ever will be a biological marker where newborn infants will all be tested for. Having a 22-year-old son who was diagnosed at 3, fortunately not just by his facial features, but by behavior and by some of the other things like no eye contact, poor suck, etc. at that early stage. And having lived through those years and having this child, now an adult, having had many benefits of support for both us, but mostly for him, and still seeing the multiple disabilities that have resulted from his from this diagnosis. So I would just like to know if you ever do see a test that will be done.
Yeah, that's our hope, because I think if we just depend on looking and describing behavior, that's not enough. So I think there's someday that we will be able to identify them through reliable biological markers. And it's maybe not at a gene or epigenetic level, it may be looking at, for instance, James Reynolds in Queen's University has looked at children with FASD and children without, and other disabilities, and shown how the eyes track objects on a computer screen is very characteristic in kids with FASD that differs from controls in children with ADHD. Looking at the saccadic and anti-saccadic eye movements. And now, I suspect also we're looking at functional MRI. In fact, we were the first in the world in Winnipeg at the National Research Council Biodiagnostics Unit to assess functional MRI studies, looking at different stimuli, looking at the children's abilities to react and what regions of the brains were reacting. And we showed significant differences in the FASD group compared to the non-FASD controls. And we also extended that study to look at ADHD kids who had no alcohol exposure prenatally, had the genetic ADHD, and looked at FASD kids with ADHD. And we could separate the two in the groups in terms of how the brain functions and how the brain connects to different centers. So there's a networking phenomena that seems to be quite different in FASD than ADHD kids and controls. So I have hope that over the next several years, I don't know, next decade, well after I have retired, that we will have a much better marker than we currently have in terms of diagnostics and assessing deficits. And then we could look at therapies. What drugs, what nutritional factors, how can we overcome these problems?
In all segments of society, too.
In all segments, right.
Yeah, the key thing about the research that we're undertaking is that it spawned from international conversations with our colleagues at Hebrew University, Adrian Fainsod, who was looking at the role of vitamin A and FASD. Our colleagues in Reunion Island in France, and Reunion Island is not in France, on the continent, it's an island on the other side of Africa, and which has a huge FASD issue. There's efforts underway in Australia to start grappling with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, looking at the guidelines and implementing them, and then they're going to have to revise their guidelines because Av just told us that they're revising them. But there's this interest in looking at a biomarker as well as in Germany and other places. And this is really important in the validation of a biomarker, is that you have to have different population groups involved in it, because our bodies is comprised of the histories of our mothers and our fathers and our grandparents, and there's a geography linked with that. and that you need to understand all of that in relation to a biomarker. And as we move forward in developing and looking at these markers through the animal models and then into human populations and a broad spectrum, and Southeast Resource Development Council, the STAR program that Marcia has spoken about, there are partners in this study, and we're going to work collaboratively together in a culturally safe way with the work of Lina Hart and her spiritual and elder ways. Lina is sitting here in the front row, and she helped connect all of us together to be able to engage so that we would have it translating to the community. And it will take time, but it's really captivated the minds, the creative minds, not only in our university, but those that are elsewhere in other universities internationally. And we really have this really nifty little network that Heather and Terry has been helping to coordinate through the Canadian, the Hebrew University, am I saying Canadian Hebrew?
Israel International Fetal Alcohol Consortium.
So it's quite broad, and there's this really tremendous interest in understanding biomarkers and the social part of it, and the paternal and the maternal aspect of it, and then the intergenerational, transgenerational, because that's another piece we don't know about. And that's the other piece that will lead from this research that we're undertaking.
Something I've read in a few books, and a common theme I've noticed is that a lot of parents who have children with FASD, they state that their doctors didn't have a conversation with them about whether or not they were drinking during pregnancy. And as Marcia said, that even a lot of your classmates didn't know a lot of knowledge. So I was wondering if there's any movement towards having doctors potentially having that difficult conversation with patients when they come in.
So I'm on a steering committee with the Canadian Association of Pediatric Health Centers, funded by Public Health Agency of Canada, look at screening tools. And there's a maternal drinking guideline, screening tools, and they've been there for years, and they're very effective in identifying women who are using alcohol. And it's important to identify them so that you can have that conversation about how can I help you in this pregnancy to reduce the drinking or the issues that you have in the pregnancy. And maybe we need to look at this to protect the baby. Because reducing, harm reduction, they may not be able to quit, but reducing the amounts of alcohol is going to benefit that baby greatly. I mean, ideally, we'd like to see no alcohol, but, when we talk about FASD is 100% preventable, only on Mars, not here. But if we can reduce the prevalence and reduce the harm, that's great. And, there are strategies out there. So you can go onto the CAFC website, click on FASD initiatives, and then find the toolkit that's been out there for the last 2 or 3 years. We've encouraged physicians and had meetings with physicians. We're meeting with women, young women in their practice to talk about this and do as a short screener and talk about this. Because I think there's good evidence that short-term discussions, under 2 or 3 minutes, strongly reduce and affect behavior. And that's what we need to do more of that. And doctors see patients for 7 minutes. I think that's the average family doctor's time they spend with the average patient. My doctor spends 40 minutes with me. I got lots of problems. He's a classmate of mine. So the time is very precious. But I think the fee schedule negotiated by doctors in Manitoba to try to deal with counseling and interventions and prevention is now changing so that they say, well, the time is valuable, and if you spend time with patients talking about prevention and strategies to reduce harm, then that's well worth it and cost beneficial. Because every dollar of prevention spent saves $7 down the pike in terms of costs.
I'd like to add, in community, when medical professionals are available, which is far and few between, they're probably spending less time one-on-one. And then we have the language barrier, where there's not an interpreter sitting right there while mom's getting, checked and things like that. So there's other issues there as to why. I like to give people a quick explanation of why medical is a treaty, right? Basically, when we signed over treaties, and there's different number of treaties across Canada, I'm not treaty number 5, actually it was my great-grandfather who signed that treaty. And with that came things like schooling, education, medical, like medicine chest, things like that. So access to care, prescriptions, dental, those kinds of things are supposed to be provided to First Nations people that live, whatever treaty area and territory. But what we're seeing is bare minimal, far and few between, terrible services. We have extremely racist nurse in charges that, oh my God, you wouldn't believe. Every person that comes in gets Tylenol and gets called a drunk. Like, it's bad. It's that serious. I'm not even exaggerating. So that system is flawed, and I have coworkers here, and we love working for our people. We would like people that work with our people to feel the same, You don't have to be First Nation to respect. And what Dr. Elias was mentioning about we are our ancestors' experiences, our elders have said that for thousands of years. We call it blood memory, and I'm so happy that science has caught up with them.
I'm just really quiet. Earlier on, you had mentioned how men can contribute to FASD, and that's kind of new for me. That's kind of the first time I've heard of this. I'm wondering if you could maybe speak more on that and kind of what research is saying.
I don't know the great details of that because I'm not an epigeneticist, but when we were mapping out this study, we were going through the state of the knowledge. So what's the latest and what's the greatest and what's the hottest topic? And this popped out, which really tweaked my interest. And because I had a conversation with a physician around a round table during one of our national FASD conferences, and there was always this focus on the maternal, and I said, well, what about the guys? I mean, like, is sperm that super that it's not impacted by alcohol? Like, does it have this Superman outfit on and it's just zooming in there? And I'm sitting there thinking, but what about kryptonite? What about alcohol? It's going to affect it in some way, and sure enough, it does. Our nutrition scientists raised it in one of our meetings, and this is a new area that it is just coming about, but there's been this heavy emphasis or bias on maternal alcohol consumption, and everyone forgot about what happened before. And there's a lot of research coming out in terms of the mental health of the woman during the pregnancy and that impact it could have on the fetus. But it's the mental health prior to that as well as the mental health of. And Clyde Hertzman made this he has this wonderful phrase that he used, that the environment gets under your skin. And epigenetics is allowing us to study that. And we never had the tools before to be able to look at this. And we didn't have these big sequencing machines that I don't know their names of because they're also changing. And so we've got one of our colleagues here that's the head of genetics. But you've got this fabulous equipment now that you can actually run these types of tests. And we may have discovered DNA and RNA some while back, but our capacity to be able to do this now economically, and that it's cheaper to run our tests, and by the time we run ours, so hopefully it'll be even cheaper because it's so costly to do this research. But this is the new and exciting part about research today, is that we can actually look at how the genes so our genes and our parents and so on and so forth, and we could look at an interaction with the environment. We've never been able to do that before. And so now we have this capacity to do it, and we've got so many researchers that are invested in this, and Reynolds, our colleagues in NeuroDovNet, and Michael Kobar in British Columbia, and everyone is quite excited about looking at this interaction where men are involved as well. But there's been this bias in science. And there's been this bias around women for a very long time. And there's this really old epidemiology study that was done in prisons. And it's the late 1800s or 1900s. It was a classic epidemiology design. We wouldn't do anything differently the way we designed the study, but it focused only on women. But there was this one case study that I came across of a physician talking about the women that was in his practice who didn't consume alcohol and was contributing all the behavioral difficulties of their children, including the learning disabilities of their children, to the drinking behavior of the men. So this has been observed, but it's never been studied in the way that we can study it now. If Abba has anything to add to the Superman analogy.
That's good.
People don't usually call my name in the same breath as Superman.
He's famous, this guy.
But in terms of going back to how do you treat, or how do you change what people do, it's not just women's behavior, it's women and men's. Not just mothers' behavior, mothers and fathers. Because I think there is evidence of biological effects on the sperm. In animal studies, we do show behavioral problems. We don't see the FAS structural changes in the birth defects from sperm exposure like they do with exposure to the embryo in the mother's womb. That's because they're critical periods of development. But you might affect some expression of certain genes that are important in neurodevelopment. But that's been the area of greatest lack of study, but it will grow. But in terms of affecting social changes, more supports for families, reducing abuse, a lot of the abuse, whether it's sexual abuse, physical abuse, is when the male or the woman is in a drunken state. So you get the effects on the baby, you get the stress, and you get the physical effects of alcohol in the adult brain, which is horrible. So it's heavy drinking that's leading to this breakdown in social chaos and FASD. So we need to look at strategies of prevention. Not just women should not drink if they're pregnant. Nobody should be drinking at a high level that's putting themselves and others at risk. And that's an important human rights issue. Do we have a right to do anything that we want? No, there are duties we have, and we have responsibilities to our spouse, our partner, our child in the womb, and to society.
I'd like to share a very quick story. I have permission to share this story. So there was a woman who had 2 fetal alcohol affected children. She gave birth. She had a case manager for her next pregnancy, and this case manager worked very closely to try and prevent, future exposed birth. They were engaged, they made wonderful work together, and they had a really good relationship. It came time for her to give birth, and baby was affected by alcohol. The case manager took it really hard. She took it really hard because she thought this time, this child is going to be born unaffected. And she came and saw the mom and said, "What happened? I thought, we were getting somewhere." And she said, "I drank to save my baby." And the person didn't understand, what does that mean? I don't get what you're saying. So her partner would beat the crap out of her if she wouldn't drink with him. So in essence, she did save her baby. I used to tell that story and not be able to get through it because I'd cry because it's really emotional. So this family violence and drunkenness are issues of human rights. What we have is patriarchal worldview clashing with a matriarchal worldview, and this is what is happening. And it's not a good picture where women feel that they are lower, and they are subordinate. So I find that a lot of time things don't need to necessarily cost money. Going in the bush can be therapeutic for people. Sitting by the water, watching the water, wash and clean, that's therapy. Being on the land, having a circle, sitting on the grass, those are all wonderful things that don't cost money and are therapeutic. It's in us, even if we've been brainwashed otherwise. It only takes a drop of that blood to have it alive in you. And the hard part is finding that within people. But it's there. You just have to make them realize it.
Okay. We're at time. There are 2 more hands up, but I think we'll stop there because we are at time, and that's an incredible place to end. And I would invite the last 2 questioners just to come to the front and pose their questions. I just want to mention that there is a beautiful Research Life magazine here, if you want to pick it up, talking about human rights research at the University of Manitoba, so a great magazine. And I would invite you to sign up for Café Scientifique for the email list if you'd like. There's a sign-up sheet here. And please fill out the evaluations. And finally, please join me in thanking our presenters today.